When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds tend to picture kings in their castles and bishops in their cathedrals. We see a world sculpted by the powerful, the pious, and the privileged, with a history written on royal parchments and sanctified in stone. But what if I told you the real story of the medieval world wasn't written in a scriptorium, but whispered over a wooden mug of ale in the corner of a noisy tavern?
Fresh alley.
What if the true pulse of the era didn't beat in the throne room, but in the smoky, chaotic, and often dangerous heart of the local drinking den? These weren't just dens of sin. They were the secret forges of society, where fortunes were made, revolutions were born, and the fate of kingdoms was decided. The medieval tavern was an assault on the senses. The first thing that would hit you as you pushed open that heavy wooden door wasn't the warmth of a fire, but the smell. A thick, almost tangible cloud of wood smoke, roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present sour tang of spilled ale. In theory, they were changed regularly. In reality, they often became a composting layer of filth, a testament to months of revelry and carelessness. The light was dim, cast by flickering oil lamps or tallow candles that seemed to create more shadows than they chased away. The air, thick and stifling in the winter from the press of bodies around a central hearth, would turn into a suffocating brew of sweat and spoiled food in the summer. And it was always loud. You'd hear the constant murmur of a dozen conversations, the clatter of wooden mugs on rough-hewn tables, the clink of coins, a sudden burst of laughter, a heated argument, or the mournful tune of a traveling minstrel. This chaotic energy wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Taverns thrived on it. They were the living, breathing heart of the community. To really get their importance, you have to realize how rigidly structured the rest of medieval life was. Society was dominated by two institutions, the manor and the church. The manor was the center of power and law, a place of obligation and servitude. The church was the seat of moral authority, a place of ritual and divine judgment. Both were hierarchical, formal, and demanding. The tavern was the opposite of all that. It was the unofficial third pillar of society, a place defined not by duty or piety, but by community and conversation. It was a space where the rigid social classes of the medieval world could, for just a moment, get a little blurry. While a wealthy patron might prefer the better wine and private rooms of a city inn, in a village alehouse, a blacksmith could find himself sharing a bench with a traveling merchant, a pardoned soldier, or even a priest trying to escape the very rules he was supposed to enforce. Word of a distant battle, the death of a king, a new tax, or the latest plague would hit the tavern long before it was ever officially announced. Here, gossip was currency. Reputations were made and destroyed, and you could feel the collective mood of a town in an instant. Before a new batch of ale was ready, an ale stake, a long pole, often with a bush on the end, was put up outside the house to signal it was open for business. It was where farmers cried over a bad harvest, and artisans celebrated a new commission. It was, in the most basic sense, the public square, the community hall, and the newsroom, all rolled into one noisy, dirty, brilliant package. It wasn't just a place to drink, it was the place to be. While the tavern was the social heart of the community, it was also its economic engine, a place where commerce flowed as freely as the ale. As trade and travel ramped up, especially after the Black Death created new economic opportunities, Inns and taverns became essential parts of the country's infrastructure. They were the service stations, business lounges, and stock exchanges of the medieval world, all rolled into one. For travelers, an inn was more than a convenience. It was a beacon of survival. Medieval roads were treacherous, often just muddy tracks that a single downpour could make impassable. After dark, those roads belonged to bandits, wolves, and things you'd rather not meet. A day's journey was a grueling 20 to 30 miles, and seeing an inn's light promised not just a roof over your head, but safety. For a merchant moving valuable goods, a good inn offered a locked room and a strong box, a critical layer of security in a lawless world. For a pilgrim, it was a place to rest. For anyone far from home, it was a sanctuary. Taverns rarely had their own kitchens, and often bought their food from nearby professional cook shops, which meant the quality could be a real gamble. But for a weary traveler or a local laborer, a hot meal and a strong drink were a vital escape from the hardships of daily life. Taverns, which were technically different from alehouses, were known for selling wine. Wine was a status symbol, an imported luxury from places like France and Spain, and selling it was a serious, highly regulated business. The guilds of vintners and brewers held huge power, setting prices and policing quality. The authorities were obsessed with the integrity of the drinks being sold. Officials called ale conners would test the quality of ale, and taverners caught watering down wine faced serious public humiliation. A common punishment was to be locked in the stocks and have the bad wine poured over your head, a very public and very sticky warning against fraud. The food was generally simple and hearty. Pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, was common, along with coarse bread made from barley or rye. The tavern wasn't just a place where money was spent. It was where the entire economic life of a region, from local farming to international trade, came together. It was, in every sense, a hub of medieval capitalism. If history is a conversation, then the medieval tavern was its loudest and most dangerous debating chamber. Behind the facade of drunken fun, these places were hotbeds of political talk, dissent, and outright rebellion. In the halls of power, speech was chained by etiquette and fear. But in the tavern, hidden by noise and smoke, tongues were loosened by ale, and ideas that would get you arrested on the street could be spoken with a little more freedom. And this wasn't just idle chatter. The tavern was the natural meeting place for anyone with a grudge against the powerful. The French chronicler Jean Froissart wrote that insurgents in the 14th century regularly used taverns to conspire against city officials. Medieval court records are full of plots hatched within their walls. It was a space outside the direct surveillance of the lord or the bishop, an anonymous environment where a rebel could speak his mind without being easily overheard. Perhaps the most dramatic example is the tavern's role in popular revolts. While it's hard to pinpoint the exact starting point of something like the English peasants' revolt of 1381, it's clear that alehouses were crucial for organizing it. The revolt was triggered by an unpopular poll tax, but the anger had been simmering for years. That anger found its voice in the places where ordinary people gathered. Radical priests like John Ball, a key figure in the revolt, delivered fiery sermons mixing social justice with religious fervor, very likely using these informal spots to reach the common folk. This is where plans were made, oaths were sworn, and messengers were sent to coordinate the rebels. The tavern didn't just help start rebellions, it was also a breeding ground for new and dangerous religious ideas. The Lollard movement, a precursor to the Protestant Reformation, found fertile ground in taverns. Lollards challenged the Pope's authority, criticized church corruption, and wanted the Bible translated into English. These were heretical, treasonous ideas. Preaching them in a church was a death sentence. But discussing them over a mug of ale? That was a different story. In taverns, wandering Lollard preachers could engage with people directly, debating theology and passing around illegal texts away from the watchful eyes of the authorities. A famous example is the White Horse Tavern in Cambridge. In the 1520s, a group of reform-minded scholars, including future Protestant leaders like Thomas Bilney and Hugh Latimer, met there to discuss the radical ideas of Martin Luther. Their meeting spot became so linked with the new theology that it was nicknamed Little Germany. This wasn't some quiet academic seminar. It was a clandestine study group, and the tavern gave them the perfect cover. It was public, yet private enough for their dangerous conversations. Even armies were raised in these places. The famous Ye Olde Trip to Jerusalem Inn in Nottingham, which claims to be from 1189, is said to have been a recruitment spot for volunteers joining Richard the Lionheart on the Third Crusade. Now, whether that specific claim is true or not, it points to a wider reality. Military captains went to taverns to find soldiers, and mercenaries went there to find work. It was a marketplace for swords, where a man's fortune could be decided by his willingness to fight. From local uprisings to continent-spanning religious reformations, the tavern was never just a bystander. It was a stage for political drama, a recruiting ground for armies, and a sanctuary for revolutionary thought. It was where the silent majority found its voice, and where the seeds of change were quietly sown, watered with ale, and allowed to grow in the shadows. Now, it would be easy to romanticize the medieval tavern as this cradle of democracy and free thought. But that ignores its other, much darker reputation. A reputation that was, in many ways, completely deserved. For every revolutionary idea whispered in a corner, there was a knife fight breaking out by the fire. For every business deal sealed with a handshake, there was a purse being cut in the crowd. The tavern was, without a doubt, a den of sin and a place of real danger. The church, especially, viewed taverns with deep suspicion. Preachers thundered from the pulpit that these were gateways to hell, where the sins of drunkenness, gambling, lust, and violence ran wild. And they weren't exactly wrong. Alcohol fueled tempers, and honor was a fragile thing. A misplaced word or an imagined insult could quickly escalate from a drunken shout to a deadly brawl. Court records from the time are filled with stories of violence that began and often ended in a tavern. In 1301 Nottingham, a man named Walter Malley was stabbed to death in a tavern. His killer fled, joined the army in Scotland, and was later pardoned by the king for his military service. It was a world where justice was often random and life was cheap. Gambling was another massive vice. Dice and card games were everywhere, even though they were officially banned. These games often led to arguments over cheating and debts, which in turn were settled with fists or blades. The tavern was also a hunting ground for criminals. Prostitutes moved through the crowds, and thieves and pickpockets were a constant threat. especially to naive travelers who had let their guard down. The very same anonymity that made the tavern a haven for political plotters also made it the perfect base of operations for criminals. Secular authorities were just as worried. Royal decrees and town laws frequently tried to regulate taverns by setting curfews, controlling prices, and limiting how many could exist in one area. In 1343, a London law required innkeepers to warn their guests to leave their weapons at the inn before going out into the streets, basically admitting the constant potential for violence. Innkeepers were held responsible for their guests' behavior and had to report any suspicious characters. The line between running a business and harboring criminals was perilously thin. And yet, for all its sins, the tavern couldn't be stamped out. Both the church and the crown, despite their condemnations, understood. These places were a social and economic necessity. Pilgrims needed them, merchants relied on them, and common folk depended on them for social connection. So, instead of abolishing them, the authorities tried to control and profit from them by collecting taxes on ale and wine. They even co-opted them, sometimes using taverns as informal courthouses or for public announcements, acknowledging their central role in civic life. This brings us to the great paradox of the medieval tavern. It was both a den of scum and villainy, and a vital community hub. It was a place of brutal violence and warm friendship. It was condemned by the church as a place of sin, yet often served as a refuge for the poor and weary, offering a brief escape from the grinding hardship of medieval life. It mirrored the contradictions of the age, a society striving for order and piety, yet drenched in chaos and human vice. The tavern wasn't just a reflection of medieval society, it was the unfiltered, unvarnished embodiment of it. The story of the tavern is the story of the medieval world itself. Complex, gritty, and way more fascinating than we often imagine. It reminds us that history isn't just made by the great and powerful, but in the everyday spaces where ordinary people lived their lives. If you enjoy uncovering these hidden corners of the past, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. And let us know in the comments, what part of medieval tavern life would you want to experience? The news from afar, the questionable food, or maybe just a strong mug of ale. So, the next time you picture the Middle Ages, don't just look to the towering spires of the cathedral or the cold stone walls of the castle. Look instead to the humble tavern, standing at the heart of it all. Because it was here, in these noisy, dirty, and dangerous places, that the medieval world was truly forged. They were social epicenters, where different classes could actually mix, share news, and build a community. They were economic engines that connected a local village to the wider world through trade and travel. They were political hotbeds, where dissent was nurtured and rebellions were planned. And yes, they were dens of sin that reflected the brutal reality of a violent age. The tavern was a microcosm of medieval life in all its messy, contradictory glory. It shows us that history isn't just a top-down story of kings and nobles, but a bottom-up story built in the everyday interactions of ordinary people. The legacy of these institutions is still with us, echoing in the pubs, bars, and cafes we go to today. They're a testament to a timeless human need, the need for a third place, a space between work and home, where we can gather, talk, argue, and connect. The medieval tavern may be long gone, but its spirit, the spirit of a community forged in the warmth of a shared fire and a shared drink endures.